Always willing to support my fellow surfer down there, whatever his motion is. Admiral, do you believe that there's going to be a resurgence of nuclear use and technology in the world?
Yes, sir, I do. And if I can just make one point, when we discuss other choices for energy, you have to consider the density of the source. If you're providing energy for a large industrial activity or a large population center, certainly we want to do everything we can with efficiency, because the cleanest megawatt is the one that's never used. We certainly want to do everything we can with renewables and distributed sources. But as I mentioned in my opening remarks, we have chosen a very energy-dense path. Today we satisfy the high concentration needs with hydro, with fossil fuel, and nuclear. And there are challenges associated with all three. When I add up the pluses and minuses, I think there's an important future for nuclear energy.
Do you believe it's important, in fact, almost echoing what Mr. Corcoran said about the fact that other countries getting into nuke without the kind of oversight we have in this country, do you believe it's not only essential for us as Americans to be involved in this, but also in the issue of being involved in what technology and how this technology is being used around the world?
Yes, I do. We need to be leaders in those processes.
I'll speak to that.
Yes.
I agree with that conclusion. However, our leadership is misdirected towards closing the fuel cycle and developing a technology that simply has been demonstrated to be unreliable and far more costly than even the light water reactor.
Well, I understand that, Mr. Corcoran. Admiral, there was discussion about the federal government's involvement in this industry. In the last 20 years, who has been the major purchaser of reactors within the United States?
In the last 20 years? No one.
Except United States Navy, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I just want to say that while we have sort of pointed fingers over the industry on one side, we have been the major consumer of reactors as a United States government, and then we wonder why has the federal government been involved with this issue when we have been the biggest consumer, the consumer for domestic sources. That being said, is when we, and one of the things I guess we need to point out that I think there's sort of this concentration of energy being needed to be sited at a certain location with the zero emission potential is not just an issue for electricity. Hydrogen production, if we're ever going to go there, either has to depend on using natural gas, which is, in my opinion, is going to be an essential transition fuel for mobile sources, or we're going to need to go to some way we can concentrate the energy for hydrogen and, for those of us in California, desalination, which we're already seeing. I don't know what other technology not only provides that option, but I think the one bum rap that I keep hearing is that when you look at the life cycle, the true costs, not the regulatory or legal costs, but the true costs, hydro where you can do it, wind generation where God's put it, and then nuclear. Overall, you compare that to the other cost, life cycle, I don't think this is one of those issues we got to choose between the economy and the environment. But my concern is this. We need to start shutting down major emitters of greenhouse gases now. We can't wait 20 years, 30 years. How do we shut down coal plants across this country without going to some kind of technology that's able to concentrate it down the line? So let me just say this. We were looking at the cost. Ms. Cray, what percent, how much effect does government regulation and litigation and tort exposure have to do with the overall costs? And I would only, and then I'd turn around and say, Mr. Corcoran, one of my concerns is my state has outlawed one of the options that has been pointed out by the UN Council on Climate Change, has outlawed that technology. At the same time, in California, we're talking about taking a lead on it. So let's talk about the regulatory, and I guess let me go back and say from the investment point of view, isn't the regulatory and the tort issue the dark cloud on the horizon when you're talking to investors?
And I offer that. So the New Start Consortium was formed to address that. I mean, you can use the word shore 'em and recognize the failure of that investment process. So that is what is on the minds of investors going forward. And part of the changes in the licensing process that the NRC invoked was to address that and to essentially pull forward all of that litigation risk before the tremendous capital investments are made. And that was not the case when the current fleet was built, where in effect you were pouring in your capital investment at the same time you were at the mercy of the regulatory process. So that huge uncertainty still is in the minds of investors, whether it's from the utility side or from the financial community itself. So our belief is that with the revised Part 52 process that will improve that, but nevertheless, our objective is to demonstrate that by getting a license in hand, again, prior to making those huge investments and to avoid the situation you're referring to.
You're exactly right, Congressman. That concern is foremost in the minds of the investment community. We have a new process. I personally believe that process will work effectively. If you have essentially complete designs that the NRC has reviewed and signed off on at the outset, if you have an opportunity to go through literally all of the environmental and safety issues around the plant before you start construction, then the risk of a problem or a surprise down the road, particularly after the capital investment in the plant has been made, ought to be relatively low. The problem is that we've got the new process and it hasn't been tested, and until we get several plants through that process and it performs as everyone intends, the financial community will look at that and say, there is a risk and an uncertainty here. Nuclear, what sets nuclear apart from every other alternative form of generation is the requirement to go through the NRC licensing process. And so that is the difference, and until we have a track record of successful performance for the new system, that uncertainty will be there.
Now, I've served on 2 environmental regulatory agencies, some of the best in the world, I think we'd agree, and I've been proud to serve on those groups, California Coastal Commission and the Air Resources Board for California. But getting back to the Admiral's statement about we're talking about a concentration of energy generation, what we've seen here is also a concentration of capital and deep pockets that attracts the type of vultures who swoop down and are looking to take their pound of flesh, and becomes a huge target to be able to generate great revenue through regulatory obstructionism and legal proceedings. And we need to address that thing, Mr. Chairman. I guess what it really comes down to is this attitude of just back off and let the system work, is the fact that we've basically have tied this industry down, and then based on the fact that they can't move, and then say, why haven't they done more? And I think there's a real challenge that we got to be more proactive on this. And as I stated before, don't think the other industries that right now are the fair-haired groups aren't going to have litigation, and come to San Diego County and take a look at the litigation against the links that are going to solar, wind, and geothermal. It's a huge uproar in a community that's very environmentally sensitive. So all of these things in the long run are going to have a lot of baggage, and we need to be proactive rather than reactive on it. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Bilbray. And